Hello and welcome or welcome back to the channel. My name is Professor G, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm a law professor and a historian, and my area of scholarly research and focus is in the slave laws and the slave codes that sustained and maintained the slaveocracy that was the antebellum South and that would eventually become the Confederate States of America. And as you could probably imagine, there are many Confederate sympathizers and revisionist historians who come to this channel and like to attack all the videos that I put up here. And one of the attacks that I get a lot is, how come you don't talk about the enslavement of whites by the Barbary pirates? How come you don't talk about how whites were enslaved, or how whites did this, or whites were slaves too, and on and on and on and on? And the answer I always give is, who cares? Or so what? Who cares is probably wrong. More so what is more of the answer. Because, of course, we should care and study all forms of slavery that have ever existed in the history of the world, right? That goes without saying. Slavery in all of its forms is horrific and wrong. Slavery still exists today. Just because I don't talk about it on this channel doesn't mean that I don't have a serious aversion to slavery that exists in the modern world. Things like sex trafficking and those forms of slavery are horrific and need to end. There are countries that still practice forms of slavery, and that all needs to come to an end. But again, I say, so what? Why does one compete with the other? Why does one take away from the other? Why does the fact that whites were enslaved by Barbary pirates, which we'll talk about today, have anything to do with the horrors or how horrific the system of African slavery was in the United States and its ongoing impact on our society today? The same as the ongoing impact of colonization on the world, let's say by the British Empire, has on their former colonies today. One does not take away from the other, and there isn't a competition, but since people want to make it a competition, we're going to discuss that today. And I'm going to explain why I personally believe that the system of African slavery that exists in the United States was the worst form of slavery in the history of mankind. And for one very specific particular reason, because it was based on race and it was racially motivated. And it was based on racial white supremacist pseudoscience. So we'll discuss that today. But again, none of this takes away from the importance of learning about all these other forms of slavery. But again, when the Barbary pirates and European enslavement was brought up, I sat and said, well, I don't see statues to Barbary pirate heroes in New Orleans or Atlanta or Montgomery or Richmond, Virginia. I don't see military bases being named after, heroes to the Barbary pirates who enslaved Europeans. But I do see that happening today in the United States because of this revisionist history to overlook the horrors of the system of African slavery in the antebellum slaveocracy. And a lot of people say, well, we know slavery was bad. We've been taught about it. No, you haven't. You really have not. You cannot begin to understand how horrible it was until you get a proper education and you read these court decisions and by these state supreme courts, and you try and follow the mental gymnastics they go through to justify the enslavement of human beings, and you truly see how racially motivated this was, and that this entire system was a system of white supremacy that didn't simply end with the passage of the 13th Amendment because it was based on race and racial pseudoscience. And that's the important thing. And people like to talk about sources, so today we're going to look at An Inquiry into the Laws of Negro Slavery in the United States by Thomas R.R. Cobb. And for those of you who go, well, who cares? Who is that? Thomas Cobb was one of the most famous jurists in the antebellum South in the state of Georgia. Now, he doesn't survive the Civil War. He becomes a Confederate officer and dies, so he has no postbellum career. But before the Civil War, in the antebellum times, he was one of the most famous jurists in the state of Georgia. He's actually affectionately known by Confederate and Confederate sympathizers as the James Madison of the Confederacy because of how instrumental he was in writing the Constitution of the Confederacy at secession. And as you know, the Confederate Constitution enshrined in their mind forever the institution of African slavery. So he is influential. And this book was meant to be a treatise on the laws of African slavery in the United States. So if you were an attorney practicing law in one of the slave states and you had a case dealing with an enslaved person, you would go to this book to find the laws you need to make your claims and to make your arguments. And in fact, many Southern courts cite this book directly. So I've used this for a lot of my research as a primary source, and it is a great window into the world of African slavery in the United States and how these white slave owners, the slaveocracy, and the judicial system in the antebellum South looked at people of African descent. So let's talk about African slavery in the United States and the Barbary slave trade. The biggest difference and what makes the American system so much worse, and in my opinion, perhaps the worst form of slavery in the history of mankind, is that it was based on race. Now, you can go back and watch a previous video, and forgive me, I'm having allergies today, so it feels like everything in my neck is all tight. But you can go back and watch a previous video I made about the Somerset decision. Now, in a nutshell, the Somerset decision takes place before the United States, so mid-1700s, and an enslaved person was brought to London. He flees, he is captured, and his freedom goes before Lord Mansfield, the King's Bench in the United Kingdom, so the British court. And Lord Mansfield decides, or he declares in his opinion, that slavery is so odious that it goes against all the laws of nature. Meaning, unless there is a positive law that says you can have slaves, it cannot exist because it goes against nature. It is unnatural. Therefore, slavery can only exist with positive law. Well, that created a serious problem for many of the southern colonies that had slaves, which eventually become the southern states, and of course, eventually the states in the United States. How are these jurists, how are these attorneys and legal scholars going to deal with this court decision that said slavery is unnatural? Well, they simply flip the script. They say no. They say people of African descent are inferior to whites. They are inferior and they were created to live in a state of submission to whites and do things like manual labor. They are physically built for manual labor and they are mentally inferior, and therefore their natural condition is to be in a state of slavery. Since it is their natural condition, therefore it does not violate the laws of nature and no positive law is necessary for it. Do you see what they did there? In fact, it was better for them, and you can go back and watch my second video on General Lee, who agrees with this kind of paternalistic idea that slavery is good for Africans because they are heathens, they are uncultured, they have minds of children, and a system of slavery is the best place for them and best fits their nature. And this comes directly from an inquiry into the laws of Negro slavery. Thomas Cobb spends an entire section on this, explaining why Africans are inferior and why they belong in a state of servitude. And he says, our conclusion from this investigation must be that the Negro race is inferior mentally to the Caucasian. Certain it is that the Negro, as we now find him, whether in a state of bondage or in his native wild, exhibits such a weakness of intellect that, when he has the fortune to live in subjection to a wise director, he is, without doubt, fixed in such a state of life as is most agreeable to his genius and capacity. Meaning, when he's in a state of slavery, that's the best place for him to be, right? So this system was based entirely on race and white supremacist pseudoscience. That's where they belong, that's their natural condition, that is what it is. The Barbary slave trade was not based on race. The Barbary pirates enslaved sub-Saharan Africans, right? So they enslaved black people that they captured or purchased through the trans-Saharan slave trade. They did enslave other Muslims who were prisoners of war. And while technically not lawful under Islamic law, which we'll get to in a second, this sometimes actually did happen. They enslaved Jews. Jewish captains were enslaved that existed in Spain, all across of North Africa. And they did enslave Americans. They did enslave people of white European descent. However, the Barbary slave trade was mostly based on a religious sort of idea here, that these were infidels. Christians are infidels. They were enslaved. It wasn't based on race. It also wasn't hereditary, right? Normally, children born to slaves were not automatically enslaved. It needs to also be said that because this was based mostly on being infidels and not being Muslims, that if someone enslaved by the Barbary pirates did convert to Islam, it didn't guarantee their freedom, but it did make the severity of their enslavement a lot less, and it did make the possibility for their freedom a lot more probable. Whereas in America, you can look and you can find this in the early states such as Virginia and even the colonies. These came up as laws in the colonies that the framers of slave laws realized we have a problem. What if a slave converts to Christianity? Can we enslave a Christian? So they made laws and put laws on the books of these states that even if a slave did convert, that didn't have anything to do with their manumission or emancipation or their freedom. So their freedom wasn't guaranteed. Whereas under the Barbary slave trade, if you did decide to convert to Islam, even if you faked it and you could just play it off, it had a potential to earn you freedom or at least a lesser sentence as a slave, or your enslavement would have been less harsh. Also, most of the Barbary pirates who captured Europeans did so for a ransom. They wanted to make money off of this. Enslavement was the fallback if no ransom could be gotten or if you weren't worth ransoming. Whereas the African slave trade and the system of African slavery in the United States was meant solely to have slaves. And there was nothing about it. You weren't going to be ransomed. You weren't going to be freed by, your family paying money. You were a slave. It was just simple slavery, right? And because the Barbary pirates enslaved people other than Europeans, they did enslave other Africans. They did enslave, other Arabs. They did enslave Africans, sub-Saharan Africans. Excuse me. They enslaved Jews. They enslaved all these people. It wasn't based on one race being ethnically superior to another. It might have been based on one religion being superior to another, right? Infidel and Muslim. But if I converted to be a Muslim, then aren't I on the same level as my captors? And again, that goes back to this idea of why they would receive a lighter enslavement or possibly be given their freedom. But when American slavery was based entirely on race and white supremacy, that creates a problem that doesn't end when slavery ends, which is why I go back to my thesis, my idea here, that American slavery, the system of African slavery, was the worst form of slavery that had ever existed. Because you could even go back to, let's say, Roman slavery, where again, Roman slavery was not based on race or ethnicity or even religion. It was based on being a prisoner of war, for example, or having a debt that you couldn't pay. But in the prisoner of war example, I could have killed you on the battlefield, so therefore I now have control of your life after the battle, after the war. But if that individual was freed, because I have no animosity, or I have no belief that my race, let's say I was a Roman and I captured someone from Carthage, so a North African, right? We're a different race according to the racial, breakdowns of that time, or even someone from sub-Saharan Africa. If I won a battle and captured someone of African descent, I was never taught, or I was never led to believe that the reason for your enslavement is racial inferiority. So if I freed you, or if you earned your freedom, you are now on an equal level with everyone else. It just depends on where you fall in society as a citizen or anything like that. However, in the antebellum South, in the slaveocracy, blacks were always considered inferior. Whites were racially superior. People of African descent were created by God to work in submission to the white race. They were mentally inferior. They were physically built to do hard labor. So therefore, even if freed, they would never be on the same level as a white person, and this was understood. So that is what you see happens at the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment. That's why I keep saying this racial form of slavery, this racial system, didn't just turn off when the 13th Amendment was passed, because it couldn't. Because these people, like Thomas Cobb, were led to believe, and by the way, when I said led to believe, a lot of these people like Cobb and his group, that age group, created this system, and I believe fully understanding that they knew it was nonsense, but they needed to justify the existence of slavery without positive law in response to the Somerset decision. But they created this racial pseudoscience, this white supremacy, and that didn't shut off when the federal government said slavery is no longer legal. So that's why I believe it is the worst form of slavery ever, because there was no flipping the switch of slave to free person, and that disconnect. There was no shutting off the fact that the whites in the South would always believe that they were racially superior to anyone of African descent. So was the Barbary slave trade horrible? Of course it was. Absolutely. Were whites enslaved? Yes. No one is denying that. But how does that take away from how horrible the system of African slavery in the United States was? And in fact, many of these whites were enslaved because they were Christian, not just because they were white. Because as I've said, the Barbary pirates enslaved many people of many other different races, as long as they, weren't Muslim, and even some Muslims who were prisoners of war, they were enslaved, but they weren't enslaved because they were white. And they could convert to Islam, they could be ransomed, they could be sold, right? There were many ways out of that system that did not exist for Africans in American slavery because they were enslaved because they were African, because they're of African descent. So I hope you understand these differences, right? In the Barbary slave trade, when a Barbary slave was freed, a ransom was paid, or he converted to Islam, or his master freed him, he was equal now with anyone else within that society, right? As long as he converted to Islam, or lived within a Muslim community as a non-Muslim, which did happen as well. So there was that hierarchy of race looking down on it, religion looking down on it. But again, you could change your religion even if you faked it. Can't change your race. So that doesn't make it any better, and I want to make sure this is clear. The Barbary system was terrible, but when you're comparing systems of slavery, it is clear the American system of slavery was exponentially worse, and because it was based on race, it led to so many horrific problems in the end that continue to plague us today, because that racism, that pseudoscience, white supremacy, didn't simply end with the passage of the 13th Amendment. So remember, as always, like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next video.